My name is Thierry Kogenzi.
I'm Yassin Aslam.
Yeah, my name is James Farr.
My name is Teresa Munchik.
My name is Rebecca Stack-Martinez.
You're speaking to Faiza Out.
I'm Anand Gute.
Hello, my name is Bama Athreya, and welcome to this podcast, The Gig. The Gig is about work and how it's being affected by technology around the world. But we're not talking about robots taking people's jobs. We're talking about apps becoming their bosses. And this season, we'll focus on the app that just about everyone has heard of or used at some point, Uber. You'll be meeting drivers from the UK, South Africa, India, even Cambodia, and finding out more about how, in the early days, they were attracted by the promise of partnership, of being their own bosses.
Dear friends, welcome to the Labor Radio Podcast Network Profile Series, highlighting the work of network members. The growing network of over 70 shows in 4 countries serves as a one-stop shop for audiences looking for labor content, and as a resource for labor broadcasters, podcasters, and content producers. My name is Evan Papp, and I produce Empathy Media Lab's podcast on labor, political economy, arts, and culture, and we're a proud member of the Labor Radio Podcast Network. Today, I'm speaking with Bama Athreya of the Gig podcast. So Bama, tell me a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, and what led you to organize labor.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Evan. It's really great to be speaking with you. Always a pleasure. I grew up in Philadelphia and Philadelphia suburbs. And, to be honest, I think my journey into the whole, this whole passion on labor rights was a little bit sideways, because I really got mobilized and energized about what was happening in the global economy when I was a child, and my family are immigrants from India, and we would go back to India not very often, once maybe every 3 or 4 years, to visit my grandparents. And here I was from this nice Philadelphia suburb, and we would go back to India, and I would see kids, right, my own age, and they were sweeping, in restaurants, and they were delivering stuff, and they were doing all kinds of work. And so actually at a young age, I just started asking these questions about why is the economy, at that point, not even having that vocabulary, but just thinking, why is it that some of us get to live in these nice houses and go to school and get good jobs and others don't? And so really, from there, it's hard to pinpoint a particular moment, right, when it became about labor and labor movements. But I just feel again, starting even at that age as a kid, asking myself why there were all these economic disparities in the world really led me to start asking questions about the global economy. And so it's always been international for me too, because I guess of that perspective of being an immigrant and having the chance to travel to other countries, including India, and realizing it wasn't just about what happens here or there.
And that's how we kind of got introduced with each other. We both are in the international development arena. And same for me. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Zambia and Southern Africa, and just seeing the disparity of wealth. And, it really kind of woke me up to seeing poverty unimaginable, at least in my experiences at that time in the United States. So I totally agree. Trying to internationalize the view of poverty and labor is a very important aspect, and that's what you are doing with the Gig podcast. But before we talk about your program, for those who may not be interested or aware of labor news, why do you think unions and organized labor are important and should be covered?
I think we really just need to have that counter narrative to this dominant, very corporate controlled media ecosystem that we're all living in right now. I mean, let's face it, right? People make, we now know, billions of dollars, not just millions, but billions of dollars off these mega media conglomerates, and they have an interest in telling the story a particular way. Now, I think stories are super important, right? Human stories are super important. That's what moves us. That's what, kind of creates change in the world. If we don't get the voices of working people into the narrative, right? Our stories, our friends' stories, right? Our comrades' stories, that dominant narrative is all that people hear. So, I mean, some of this is about the fact that we just need a network like this one to be telling the real stories of working people, because that is what's going to create change in the world.
And could you talk about your show and why you actually want to focus on this aspect and what it's about?
Sure. So I've worked, as a human rights, and really coming from a human rights perspective on documenting worker stories and for worker rights advocacy around the world for a long time. And, started really cut my teeth as a student activist in the anti-sweatshop movement in the 1990s, right? And at that point, it was like women workers in sports shoe factories making Nikes, right? I mean, those were the stories that I was recording and telling, and I was recording them not in a podcast sense, right? Not in a broadcast sense, but in a written sense, like, let's document these stories. Let's tell people what's happening. And they said to me, like, we want you to tell people, like, they're buying the stuff that we make. So we want you to tell people, like, what happens to us as we're making the stuff that you people are buying. So I started documenting those stories. Fast forward to last year. I had, for the past few years, been super interested in the fact that I was, continuing to work and travel internationally. And everywhere I went, there was like an app for everything. It was crazy, right? I was going to like places that people hardly had mobile phones a few years ago, and now everything was getting connected through an app. And I was like, well, that's interesting. Like, what's that mean? What is this gig economy? It seems like this shiny new thing, but what's it really like for the men and women that work in it? Because it's one thing, right? Again, back to what you were just asking, like, to get that story that comes across when you read the newspapers, and the stock prices for these companies are going through the roof, and they're like these overnight billionaires in Silicon Valley from these platform companies, but no one was really like paying attention to, okay, but who actually works? Who gets jobs through these things, and what's it like for them? So I thought, I'm not convinced that it's really all that different for somebody who's like, a driver or a delivery person in India or in the United States. How different is it really? So I thought I would just go, run around the world and document these stories. And I loved the idea of doing a podcast and not a written set of reports, because honestly, I think it's important that people hear the stories in workers, in the individual's own words. And there's something about a podcast, even though of course you edit, of course you select the clips, but still it's their words. I can't tell the story for them when you're listening to their story. So that was what was really fun about documenting the stories in this way.
And you met with drivers in the US, in Brazil, in the UK, in India. How did you identify these drivers, and kind of walk us through season 1 of the Gig podcast, because you do build it in a way, and it's incredible soundscape as well, and it's a very high end production, and really appreciate it, and listeners definitely need to check it out. So can you talk a little bit more about just some of the things that you were seeing or hearing from the voice of these workers?
Great. This is what happened. I intended in the beginning, when I started this project, right? So it was a little over a year ago. It took about a year to get it from start to finish, and I thought I was going to document stories of gig workers generally, meaning people doing all kinds of work through platforms. And I didn't even know where to start, so I suddenly just kicked myself out of the country and go somewhere and start talking to people. So I flew off to South Africa, and I had been to South Africa several times, so I had labor networks. I mean, I knew people in the labor movement there, so I wasn't starting totally cold. I called up people I knew, and I said, how do I start to talk to people who were working on these apps? And it wasn't just drivers, but people who were working for cleaning services and other things as well. And, so that's how everything happens. I think you ask somebody and they introduce you to somebody, and then they introduce you to someone else. And so I started in a place, once again, where I had some contacts, so it wasn't just all cold. But what happened over the course of the next several months that I did not expect is that everywhere I went, there seemed to be a story about Uber. And that wasn't the case, like, when I conceived of the project. But something was happening over the course of this past year where drivers in different countries were starting to find out what each other were doing. So I interviewed drivers in South Africa, Uber drivers in South Africa. And I was just starting to learn that people were mobilizing and organizing the driver community in other countries. They knew more than I did. They were like, oh yeah, we heard about that strike in Kenya. Did you read about the stuff in Brazil? And they were telling me, because they were tracking just on their news alerts and everything, the fact that drivers were organizing elsewhere. And unbeknownst to me that, again, there was this real sort of groundswell. So that was super exciting. So I just decided that that was the story that I needed to track. And in that way, I was able to learn from people that I met who else was organizing, and then go to them and ask them for time to tell their stories as well. And so that got me hopscotching to these countries and places that I had not expected. And it was because there was this emerging network where drivers knew each other, or organizers, at least in the driver community, knew each other, and were able to say, oh, well, have you talked to so-and-so?
Yeah, I remember when I first heard about the Gig podcast, that word started becoming ubiquitous almost like a decade ago, I think now, where it's just saying, oh, look at this great freedom for the worker to be able to, be able to choose their hours and things like that. And over time, it's become a bait and switch, and where people in the very beginning were making decent money, and then eventually these unprofitable companies have been just kind of taking over the markets. And this concept of algorithmic management that you talk about quite a bit, it's something that is the future of a lot of these companies trying to manage workers through an algorithm. And it's in some ways highly undemocratic, but I do find a lot of hope in the Gig podcast, because there are these international networks being developed, and they're fighting back. So I really appreciate it. So looking at the Labor Radio Podcast Network, you're a member. Could you talk a little bit about how you heard about it and why you think it's important that folks should check out the network and join the network if they're producing shows?
I think it was such a find when I can't even remember how I got connected. I can't remember if it was that someone came across the podcast or if I came across the network first, but I was able to get in, I think, in kind of the early stages, and learn about how other people were both like just really taking the subject matter, right? The interviews that they were doing and what they were doing with them, and hearing the stories and hearing the other podcasts, which was super educational. But what was also great is, like all things, when you have a community that are committed to doing something together, right, that have a common purpose and are committed to helping each other. And that's what's great about it. Committed to saying, if you don't know how to do something, or you've never done this before, or you need to reach out and you don't have a contact, we will help you. And so the network is, I think, a great resource for everybody, in part because of what you and I were talking about before. It's a great resource for the general public everywhere, because collectively, this entire set of broadcasts and podcasts tell really, really, really important stories. And no matter where you want to start, in terms of like the very different range of broadcasts and podcasts that are available, you're going to learn something. You're going to learn something interesting, and you're going to be able to hear from workers in their own voice. So that's great. And I think for those of us, if anyone out there is like thinking about, do I want to get involved with this network? If you have a podcast or a broadcast that is aligned with our, mission and our subject, the people are an amazing resource. And the stuff that we share, even just in terms of things like events that are coming up, resources that we've come across, challenges that we faced, it's been fantastic.
Yeah, and I so much gratitude to you for introducing me to Chris Garlock, and that's how I found the network as well. And now I'm all in supporting it. So looking into the future of organized labor, where do you see opportunity and hope?
I am, it's kind of a moment. So let's talk about this together, Evan, because, I think neither of us have the answer to this. So it's an interesting thing to sort of think about. Is it the best of times or is it the worst of times? And it's usually both, right, at the same time. Here are the things that I think about as somebody who, just get a little serious for a moment, right, as a kind of someone who's looked at these larger global economic trends for a long time. This is a time of unprecedented capital concentration. And that is a scary thing. And that's what the trajectory has been over the past decades of fewer and fewer people worldwide controlling ever greater amounts of resources of capital. So we've got this handful now of people who've I think we hit the $1 trillion mark, like a single individual has $1 trillion.
I think we're a few years away from it, but COVID has definitely accelerated it for many billionaires.
Yeah, so I mean, we've got this moment where the world which is unlike anything the world has ever seen. So that's what we're up against. Now, what that tends to do, though, it does focus the mind, right? We have a problem, and it's a problem that we have got to solve as a global community. It's in our mutual interest as a global community to solve the problem of that, unprecedented concentrated wealth, and look at what we can do to really bring up everyone's living conditions, everyone. And there are ways we can do that. People have had ideas for how to do that, right? But you can't get anything to happen without solidarity and without collective power. So I don't think it's going to be easy. I mean, it never is. But I do think, we do have this moment where it's really clear, really, really clear what the problem is. And that is a good starting point for really making sure that what we've seen in recent years, which are just waves of, there really has been a groundswell of popular unrest in country after country after country. And for the most part, it's not about the type of government, it's about the fact of kleptocracy. I mean, that's something that we've seen, right? It doesn't matter if you've got a right-wing populist government or you've got a left-wing, the fact is that, people around the world are sick and tired of capital, of corporations and concentrated economic clout and power controlling their governments. And so the only corrective is for all of us, I think, and it's not going to look like the labor movements of the past, in my view. I mean, I'm going to stop now because I want to see what you think about the same question, but I don't think it's going to look like the labor movements of the past, but I think these popular movements are a sign of yet more to come.
I agree that we are in some of the most dire times of my life and of modern history. And I do see labor and organized labor as both a means and an end. I see it as a means to consolidate and organize, educate, organize, and mobilize people to counter this extreme concentration of capital in the hands of a very few oligarchs. And it's basically oligarchy. And the concept of oligarchy you can read in Plato 5,000 years ago. So I think the idea of labor too, also, it raises class consciousness. The fact that a lot of people have been taught to not think in class conscious terms, I think that is starting to erode, and people are starting to come to the realization that there are different classes, and there's working class and then there's non-working class. And the working class is what is creating the value, and all of the gains in the system need to be more equitably distributed through this working class, essentially. And that's a big part of it. And I'm hopeful that we're not only going to consolidate the labor, organized labor, and both nationally in the United States and internationally, but I want to go on the attack. I think when you look 100 years ago, there used to not be 5-day work weeks. There used to not be 40-hour work weeks. There used to be child labor laws and these type of things. I want to go on the attack. Why not have 4-day work weeks? Why not have 30-hour work weeks so that people can spend more time with their family in leisure? So unfortunately, there's very few people that are working in jobs that give them a lot of purpose and meaning. They do it because out of necessity. But everything outside of work is what oftentimes is what gives us value: family, friends, community, art, culture, and those type of things. And so my hope is that not only are we going to consolidate and work together and organize and educate each other and mobilize and then govern, in the sense that we actually improve our working conditions for not just us, but for future generations. But it's going to take the struggle of our lifetimes to get there. And I think labor history has given me a lot of hope that, there's been tons of battles lost in the past, but we also are not in slavery anymore, at least in this, in our white collared, circles and those type of things.
Well, I mean, this does bring us back around, though, what you have said about, I agree about going on the offensive, and I agree about asking for more, not just saying, oh, can we, make sure we still don't have child labor, but, going well beyond that to really insist on decent work for all of us. But I think this brings us round to, talking about the show, the gig again, because we have to be mindful of the fact that, exactly the bill of goods that is being sold by these platform companies, these gig companies, is flexibility. Oh, you only have to work as many hours as you want to work. You can have your family life. You can go take care of your kids, right? And then you can just work when your kids are in school. So they're selling this, again, this false bill of goods that you can have all this great flexibility and, not work so hard, when in reality, more than ever, these platforms are turning people into wage slaves. So I just say that because I think we have to be mindful of the fact, and I've said this elsewhere, that in a very real way, the U.S. is a submerging economy. Like you and I have worked around the world, and we've heard this term, developing economies and emerging economies, right? Where supposedly middle class is growing and people are getting more wealthy. We're going the opposite direction, right? Middle class is shrinking and hollowing out. People are now being forced into increasingly precarious work in these delivery jobs and driving jobs and care work jobs, right? And so I think we do have to go on the offensive. I just think, though, going on the offensive is going to look different because, I guess I'll turn it back to you to see what you have to say about that, because it's not going to be about 35-hour work weeks.
Yeah, and I think the brilliance of this so-called gig economy is trying to sell the concept of freedom. You're more free as a worker, but it actually is the opposite of that. And the concept of wage slavery used to be well known. I mean, Frederick Douglass was writing about chattel slavery versus wage slavery, and wage slavery, the hand-to-mouth existence that makes it impossible to have a democratic populace if you're with people with hungry bellies, essentially. I believe that there have been markers put down in the Economic Bill of Rights, for instance, that was never passed in this country, but was at least discussed in 1940 or 1944 in FDR's State of the Union address. Those are the type of things where I think can at least help guide us towards the horizon of what we need. But the algorithmic management is real, and it's growing because it's so profitable. I read something today that California is going to use algorithmic management for their court system to determine bail determinations and sentencing. I mean, that's insanity. But in California is supposed to be this, left-wing progressive state, and we all know that it's a mixed bag. But that's kind of where I'm at. But I'm hopeful with meeting people like you doing such amazing work and hearing about the people struggling and fighting in your podcast, the gig podcast. So.
Well, I think it's great to think about, because if not us, then who, right? So we need to think about what will it mean to organize in the face of some of these new challenges. And, it's been a privilege, right, throughout the whole course of all of the meetings and interviews that I've done, to hear what people think is important, people in the gig economy think is important. And so I do want to say, I think it's interesting to think about some of the concepts that we have had for well over 100 years, like seizing the means of production. what does it mean in today's economy if we really want to give power back to workers, if workers want to take power back for themselves? What does that mean and what does it look like? And one of the things that is super fun, and people should go listen to the podcast if you want to learn more about this, is the idea that data is in fact the new oil. And so the one thing that, workers that I talk to, and some of them, again, you can hear directly from them on the podcast, about what they can do to seize the means of production is taking back control of their data. And that would be huge.
I absolutely agree that data is everything, and it's going to take legislation. It's going to take actually controlling the halls of power in our so-called representative democracy. So I think that's going to be an essential component, is not only organizing the workers to band together in the private sector, but then to come together and have people who understand the gig economy to run for office and be able to legislate more fairly and to protect workers. Really appreciate all the expertise you bring, seeing you as a professor even. When I first saw you.
Yeah, I'm going to try and fire up those students, man. We're going to be doing a lot of discussions of patriarchy and capitalism in that class, right? Because it's the whole intersection of gender and labor. So it's all that. But, honestly, I mean, I kind of feel the same way about the labor movement that I do about the Democratic Party. Like, they're a mess. Yeah. I just, like, it's not about waiting for organized labor to get its shit together.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the organizing labor is we got to do it, right? Like,
that's the whole thing, right? So we just got to do it.
If not us, who, if not when, or if not now, then when. So, yeah. But I agree, that like all these old institutions need to be, shaken apart and dusted off and rebuilt. So.
They really do. So let's see what happens, because I also feel like we've got this whole generation now that are, the generation below us, that are coming into crap jobs, knowing that they basically have no potential for advancement unless they are among that lucky few that make it through the window, right? And like, you got to think, like, I've had a good career. I've been, advanced. I've gotten promotions. I've gotten increasing pay over the course of my, my career. If that doesn't exist anymore and people don't have that pathway, like, there's going to be some major mobilizing that happens, and it's not going to look like the same old labor movement.
Yeah, no. And I feel the same way. Like, I saw the crash and was just coming online like in 2001. But USAID and a nice government job allowed me to put a roof over my head and buy a house, these type of things, and do a bunch of savings. So the last, many months I've been able to kind of focus on my passion, which is, activism and these type of things. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's and then another part that I was thinking was like, a lot of people haven't seen a productive economy, right? So I grew up in Midwest, and all my dad's friends were like in the steel, and my father was a PhD in aluminum anodizing, and the means of production isn't just service economy. And if China wants to turn off, I mean, they're the sweatshop of the world, and it's moving to other places, but China is an issue. Like, China as a management of the global economy and how they manage the global economy is going to go into it's already going into the United Nations, the WTO, and their influence, as bad as the United States has been, especially over the last 20 years with all the war, or last 50 years with all the wars of imperialism and other things. It's like, we have a better fighting chance here than in China or Russia, for that matter. And so, but we have to bring the means of production back, but do it environmentally sound with labor rights. And, in some ways I believe in tariffs. If, not the way Trump does it, but you don't allow slave goods to come in and dump into your economy. You allow your work. It's not a race to the bottom, runaway shop. It's just Trump bastardized the word tariffs.
Yeah, no, I mean, right, a free trade. So the whole trade liberalization has been the bane of like everything, in my view.
So Bama Athreya, thank you so much for your time, and everyone should check out the Gig podcast.
Thanks, Evan. Great to talk to you.